Good evening. It's not fair to sing a song that good right before the lesson because it just kind of makes you want to keep singing instead of hear a lesson. I was singing it walking up and I noticed myself humming and I was like, oh, I'm the only one doing that. Happens to me a lot though. If you saw the title of the lesson tonight, we are using the idea or the picture of a bully to talk about God. Now, there is one really famous example of this. There is a guy, some of you have probably heard of him. His name is Richard Dawkins. He is one of the most probably well-known and like oft-recruited atheist speakers. And he is aggressively atheist. Like he's not like the laid back, I don't really have enough evidence. He is like the I hate God kind of atheist. And so he has this really famous quote. I'm not sure I can pronounce every word that's in it because, of course, when you're an atheist and you don't have the truth on your side, you have to try and sound smarter than you are. But he says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Notice his little jab there. He says he's jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving, a control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Now, I couldn't listen to that the first time without feeling a certain visceral reaction, and I imagine some of you feel that as well. I want to emphasize, though, the way that he describes this God of the Old Testament as a bully. You notice in a lot of the examples that he points out, and certainly he's not a moron, all right? He probably can make a much better case than just this short snippet. This is his most inflammatory, most aggressive way of getting someone's attention. And there are problems in the Bible. There are things that you look at and you go, man, on its face, that makes me uncomfortable. And if we try to pretend that they're not there, those things will eat us alive. However, when he describes God as a bully, it almost feels to me like he's not reading the same book. Right? I mean, you understand that there are some problems when you read through the book of Joshua and these conquest narratives, and God gives plain instruction, kill everyone, wipe them out. That makes me uncomfortable. It does. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. But to describe God as a bully, again, it feels like maybe we're not even playing by the same rule book or reading the same handbook. When you read throughout the Old Testament, you notice there is one fundamental characteristic of this God, and it is that he is never on the side of the bully. He doesn't ever seem to be on the side of the oppressor. This is a picture. The stories we're told about this God are stories of a God who is constantly going to bat for the oppressed, not the oppressor. One of the first stories we actually have is in Genesis chapter 4. We can turn over there and read it. It's a very short story. Some of these stories we tell kids, when we tell them, they're longer than when we read them. Have you noticed that? Like the flood is a pretty short story, and then we tell it, and it takes a whole VBS week. Anyway, so this is the story of Cain and Abel. It's a fairly short story. Let's just begin here in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 4. It says, Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, one day, right? In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. And Cain spoke to his brother Abel. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying is crying to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Now, this is one of the first stories of oppressor and oppressed. It's Cain and Abel, and in this case, you've got Cain acting as the oppressor. He is angry about the offering situation. God seems to favor Abel's offering, and implicitly he doesn't favor Cain's offering. And that it's interesting because I see my son in this. When something bad happens to Bonnie, immediate anger, right? But when something bad happens to Moses, it's like defeat, and then boiling rage swells with it. Like it says Cain hangs his head and became angry. And so it's like he's disappointed, but also he's not disappointed and motivated. He's disappointed and he sees someone else in his way from what he wants. And so his head falls and he gets angry, and God gives him a warning right there. And it says the very next thing that happens just in the course of this story is he has a conversation with Abel. What was that conversation about? Right? His problem wasn't with Abel. So maybe he started in on Abel. You're keeping, God likes you. What did that sound like? I don't know, but it didn't go well. They found themselves in a field, and Cain found himself unable to master sin, and he kills his brother. And what's really interesting is at no point, you'll notice, at no point does Cain cry out to God. You don't see Cain in this story saying, God, please accept my offering. Or God, where are you? Why are you showing? He doesn't cry out to God. He has a conversation with Abel. He takes up his problem with Abel. He murders Abel. Who does God hear in this story? He only hears one person, one thing that God actually hears in this story. He hears the blood of Abel crying out to him. You notice God doesn't go to bat for Cain. After Cain does this, God doesn't go, Cain. Yeah, I know Abel was a little bit annoying, but like you gotta do better than that, right? Like he's not sitting there buddy with Cain. In fact, after Cain does what he does and oppresses or murders his brother, Cain receives a significant punishment, so much so that Cain responds, this is too much for any person to bear. God doesn't take the side of Cain. He takes the side of Abel's blood, right? God hears Abel's blood, not Cain and his offering. This is not a God who is a bully, but a God who is siding with the oppressed rather than the oppressor. The most probably famous example of this is the Exodus. This is the story when God has his people in Exodus, in Egypt, and they become enslaved. And Pharaoh looks around and sees that there are a lot of these foreigners in our land, and if at any point they decide that they want to join our enemies, we're done, because there are so many of these people in our land. And so he puts them into slavery. He subjects the rest of these foreigners, these immigrants, if you will. He puts them in chains and forces them to make bricks and do manual labor. Sun up to sun down. He reduces the value of a human to a number of production. All right, this is what this Pharaoh does because he's afraid that these people will take him over and that what he has will be taken from him. And so he bites before he can get bit, so to speak. And God's people are slaves in Egypt at that point. Eventually, we know that God, he's aware of the suffering of his people. He doesn't come talk to Pharaoh and say, listen, I get it, right? Like at no point does God say, Abel, I get it, or Cain, I get it. Pharaoh, listen, I understand. Now, when we interact with people who are acting poorly, that's often a way that we do it, right? We try and empathize. That's not this God. This God doesn't look at Pharaoh and say, listen, yeah, there are a lot of them. This was a good tactical move, Pharaoh, but you can't do that, right? Like, he shows up and he says, let them go. Stop it. Let my people go. And then when Pharaoh doesn't, he says, all right, it's time to teach you a lesson about what happens when a bully oppresses a people. And he takes them out. I mean, he systematically dismantles the theology of the Egyptians, right down to the firstborn in every house. There was not a house that didn't lose somebody as a result of that 10th and final plague. And God acts on behalf of not the Egyptians, not the innocent bystander, but he acts on behalf of the oppressed, the people who are being bullied. That's the side God is found on in the story of the Exodus. And as we've said a number of different times, this story is the fundamental story in understanding who God is. Every time he reminds his people, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, right? I mean, this is the story God points to more often than any other story to describe himself. And so in this story, what do we have? We have a God who stands on the side of the oppressed, a God who is not on the side of the bully. Dare I say, never on the side of the bully. And you might sit there and you might say, well, you know, in Richard Dawkins' atrocious quote, he does accuse God of being a nationalist, a racist, right? Like these were God's people after all. Surely God would take care of God's people. Well, back up to Genesis 16. In Genesis 16, you've got Abraham and Sarah struggling with their understanding of, Genesis 17, I'm sorry. Struggling with the understanding, 16, good grief. I'm all over my page here. Abraham and Sarah are struggling with understanding how God is going to fulfill this plan to them, this promise he made, that they're going to have descendants, numerous descendants, and they don't even have one kid. And so Sarah comes up with this plan to have a child with Hagar, and that's we'll just pick up in verse 2. Sarah said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. And Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. And the angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly, I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered, and Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael, and Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So, again, that was a whole chapter. That was not a very long read. When you look at this story, you've got Sarai, right, and we've talked about this before, trying to take matters into her own hands. She's trying to accomplish this blessing that was promised by her own will, right? If God is going to keep us from having a kid, then let's just do it this way, right? We'll force his hand to keep his promise to us by having our own kid in our own way. But that plan sort of backfires, like all of us would assume it would, right? You're being set up for failure here because when Hagar, who, by the way, was an Egyptian. Now, notice real quick. Hagar was an Egyptian slave of God's people. In this instance, the characters you have are God's promised vessel, Abram, like the guy God chose in Genesis 12 to partner with to fix this world that has been in constant fracture since Genesis 3. This is his guy, you know? And you would expect God to overlook some blemishes on behalf of his guy. When a boss appoints a new manager and it's his guy and he has skin in the game, right? He has vested interest in the success of his guy. He overlooks some and he makes excuses for. And yet, we don't see that here. We don't see that. We see a God who, in a situation where you have an oppressor in Sarai and the oppressed in an Egyptian, a foreigner, Hagar, we see a God who stands on the side of the oppressed. Who sees God in this story? It's been 10 years, and Abraham and Sarai are sick of it. They have not heard from him. They are confused about how it's going to work. It's been 10 years. And then they decide to oppress their servant, their slave, Hagar, and she's out in the wilderness. And she hears from the angel of the Lord. And she is seen by God, so much so that she is the first person in the story of the Bible to give God a name, to call him the God of seeing. We've talked about this before, but this is the phrase that's translated Jehovah Jireh. This is Hagar, the oppressed, who God stands on the side of. He doesn't sit there and go, yeah, Sarai, that was a bad idea, and she's out of here now, but you're my people, Now, he does tell her to go back. He does tell her to submit, but he does it with a promise. He makes a new promise because of the oppression. He says, listen, I'm going to be with you, and you will be a great nation through your son, Ishmael. Man, I'm not seeing the same God Richard Dawkins sees. I'm seeing a God who matches very well with the description of God in the Psalms. I'm seeing a God who partners, who is there with the oppressed. You know what we see is we see a God who hears the cry of the oppressed. He hears the blood of Abel. All right, I'm seeing a God who sees the oppressed, who sees the people who are being hurt. He sees Hagar. I'm seeing a God, when we read these stories, who takes action. He acts on behalf of the oppressed. The story of the Exodus and the story of his people being delivered out of slavery in Egypt. This is what you see. And it matches, like we said, with so many of the things that are spoken about God. Look at Psalm 10. Psalm 10 and verse 17. Psalm 10 and verse 17 says, O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, so that man who is of earth may strike terror no more. Who does the psalmist here say has God's ear? It's the oppressed. It's the fatherless. You hear the desires of the afflicted. This is who the psalmists understood this God to be, with their stories and their scripture and their understanding of God, as partial as it may have been. They didn't even know about Jesus, right? The guys that wrote these psalms, they weren't like, well, Jesus shows us who God really is. All they had was the Old Testament, and that's all they knew of this God, was that he is the kind of God who does not side with the bully. He sides with the oppressed. He hears the cry of the oppressed, and he does justice to the fatherless and the oppressed. Look at Psalm 68, the same sentiment here in Psalm 68. It describes God as Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. The Father of the fatherless and protector of widows. Now, in the Old Testament especially, you notice that these groups, the orphans and the widows, and often the immigrants are included in that group as well. These are the groups that are most likely to be oppressed and the least advantaged in society. As a widow, you would not have certain protections and standings culturally, and so you would be extremely vulnerable and easy to take advantage of. Certainly, you don't need explanation as to why an orphan may be easy to take advantage of, in this culture especially. And the immigrant at that time would have also been somebody that would not have the same rights, would not have the same standing, an easy target for oppression. And because they were an easy target, these groups were often just the victims of oppression. And so God is depicted as being a father of the fatherless. Whose side is he on? The oppressed. He's a protector of widows. Again, whose side is he on? The oppressed. This is who God is in his holy habitation. And then, of course, our verse from the bulletin, James chapter 4 and verse 6, says, but he gives more grace. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. God is against the bully, the proud, and he is on the side of the oppressed or the humbled. And so this is the picture of God that we're given. Not a cosmic bully, as some have described him, but over and over again, we're told stories about a God who, regardless of who is doing the oppressing and who is being oppressed, sides with those who are oppressed. A God who is never on the side of the bully. He hears the cry, he sees the oppressed, and he acts on behalf of them. In fact, all three of those are present. Look at Exodus chapter 3. All three of those are present in the story of the Exodus. In Exodus 3, when God is talking to Moses at the burning bush, Moses has fled into the wilderness, and he's tending sheep of his father-in-law Jethro, the high priest of Midian, and he sees this bush that, as I described to my kids, I said the burning bush, but it was the not burning bush. And then I said, well, it was on fire, but it wasn't hot. So that's how I described it to them. But this not burning bush. In Exodus 3 and verse 7, it says, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, and I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So, listen, you have a God who hears the oppressed people, who sees the oppressed people, and who acts on behalf of the oppressed people. He doesn't act on behalf of the Egyptians. He doesn't act on behalf of Cain. He doesn't act on behalf of Sarai. He acts on behalf of the oppressed. This is the God that we serve. This is a fundamental trait of who this God is. The biblical authors understood it. The psalmists, the poets, all saw this character trait of this God from the Old Testament. And here's the truth, is that message has an implication. There's an implication in God being a God of the oppressed. And here's what it is. How you treat people determines how God treats you. Right? Listen, if the Egyptians were not oppressing the Hebrews, would we have needed the 10 plagues? Would they have found themselves opposed to God? Likely not. I mean, the Hebrews were there for 400 years after all. It wasn't until the oppression that God stepped in and got involved. You think about Hagar. If she was well taken care of and blessed and cared for by Abraham and Sarai, would God have needed to step in? I don't suppose so. Would God have still made her Ishmael a great nation? Possibly. But he wouldn't have had to step in and defend the oppressed. He wouldn't have had to change Abraham's name from Abram to Abraham. But I don't think we've talked about this briefly before, but Abram is a father of great nation. Abraham pluralizes it, right? The father of great or many nations, right? Definitively, it wasn't part of the plan, Abram. You were supposed to be a father of one people, and now you're a father of many. And those many people are going to be at each other's throats for the rest of existence. You think about Cain. I mean, Cain found himself an enemy of God, a recipient of cursing of the ground and cursing of his name, so much so that Cain says, who could even stand up under this cursing? Who could bear this? I mean, if Cain had loved his brother, loved his neighbor as himself, so to speak, would he have found himself opposing God? No. In all likelihood, no. And so you've got this implication of the character of God that he is never on the side of the bully. So if you're the bully, you're not on God's side. That's it. It's as plain and simple as it gets. We serve a God who goes to bat, who hears, who sees, and who acts on behalf of the oppressed. And if you are the oppressor, look out. Look out. Because this is not who our God is. He didn't get buddy-buddy with the oppressor, whether it's his people or not. He is never on the side of the bully. And as we look at these stories and we think through this is very clear to see. But again, this was then, right? We're not necessarily dealing with slavery right now, right? We don't necessarily kick out our Egyptian slave woman because, we had this plan for her to sleep with her husband to have a child to keep God's promise. That's not us. That was Sarai, but that's not us, right? So how does this relate to us? Do we find ourselves playing the role of oppressor? Do we find ourselves in the position of bully? Well, when I use the word bully, you probably think, I haven't bullied anyone since high school, right? Like, I get it. I use that sort of as a caricature, a cartoon, to communicate the point about the oppressor, the hurter of other people, someone who is hurting other people for their own gain or for their own benefit. And so when I say bully, I don't just mean someone who's mean-spirited and probably has freckles and is actually insecure and steals lunch money. Not the picture, that's the caricature, okay? But when I talk about this position of oppressor, what I'm really asking you is, are you in that position that we found these people in? You think about Sarai. What was her problem really? Why was she treating Hagar poorly? Why did she oppress Hagar? Well, it's because she was jealous. I mean, to understand the full psychology of what Sarai was going through would be difficult. But that was her value in the world, was her ability to bear children. And you imagine the emotional roller coaster that she had gone on knowing she's not going to be able to do that. I mean, it was known. And then hearing that her husband had talked to God and he said, you're going to do that. And then having this glimmer of hope for a decade and not being able to do that. And then having a plan, a concession, and maybe having hope in that plan that maybe this will fulfill me or satisfy me or I will feel or be viewed as valuable because of this. And then it does not go the right way, and there's resentment, and then there's jealousy, and then there's hurt, and there's grief. And she lashes out because of that. Listen, have you ever lashed out because of jealousy or grief or hurt? Well, suddenly that's a bit more relatable scenario, isn't it? We can find ourselves jealous of somebody else and attempt to blow their light out to make ours shine brighter. You know, some preachers have hair jealousy, and that's just a thing they have to deal with, you know? Some people have real problems with jealousy where I can't be around that person because I want what they have, or because I can't laugh when they get a laugh because I'm supposed to be the funny one. Or, I mean, some of this stuff is petty, but if we're being honest with ourselves, this manifests itself in our life. How you treat people is what we're talking about, and all of us treat people in our day-to-day life, all right? And so maybe jealousy turns us into the oppressor. It certainly can, and it did in Sarai's case. Maybe it has to do with fear. When you think about, like we mentioned in the Exodus story, the Pharaoh in that story was terrified, and understandably so. He just took one look around and said, too many people, they're going to take what I have. They could take what I have if they wanted to. I got to take care of them. I got to make it to where they can't get what I have. I got to step on their throat to keep them beneath me because I'm terrified of them taking something from me. Man, like maybe it was self-preservation. You could say that for the Pharaoh in Egypt. At any rate, fear and self-preservation are definitely emotions that we experience and can put us in the position of the oppressor. There are situations, certainly, I mean, maybe this is a silly example, but there are going to be situations in families where everyone rags on that one cousin. everyone kind of picks on him and is, joking, but mean. But joking, but mean. And as a serial joker and pick on, I love picking on people. I love joking. I love making fun and being fun with people. I love that. I'm not saying to pick on people is always wrong, but there is a dynamic relationally where it can become a problem. There can be a dynamic where they're the butt of the joke, so I don't have to be. I'm feeling like people are making fun of me and I don't like it, so I'm going to make fun of the person we all make fun of who is an easier target. There can be a dynamic of fear or self-preservation in a workplace. If I don't do this kind of thing and treat people this way, I'm not going to have success. I'm not going to be viewed as an alpha, right? This can creep in. And you can find yourself in the position of oppressor simply because of fear or self-preservation instincts or a desire to fit in a group. And when you find yourself in a position of oppressor or bully, you do very quickly find yourself opposing God. You can also find yourself in a position of oppressor by using people. This is, I think, probably one of the most difficult to explain and also prevalent life-permeating examples. But we have a tendency in America to look at people as what we can get from them. I hate this because I think I'm the only one that feels this way, but networking has just always kind of grossed me out. I know, in the realm of networking, you're supposed to be making those relationships because you can both benefit I get it. But approaching a relationship with the idea of what can you do for me just doesn't feel Jesus-y, right? It doesn't feel right. It feels very much dehumanizing. And so when we look at people with that attitude, man, we can quickly find ourselves in the position of oppressor. And maybe this isn't just in that way, but it could be in manipulating people. Maybe you don't tell the truth in this situation. You shade it one way because I need this person to react this way. Because if they react this way, then I'll get something I need out of that interaction. I'm not going to tell them all the information because if they know all the information, they might do the thing that I'm doing and then they'll get credit for it and it'll make me look worse. Listen, I don't know what exact scenario we're talking about, all right? I'm not thinking of anything specific, but you can become the oppressor when you begin using people to get something rather than to give something. When you are picking on people to tear down rather than to build up, and yes, you can pick on people to build them up, all right? And when you start acting out of jealousy and fear, you can quickly find yourself in the position of oppressor rather than oppressed. Really, what this boils down to is when you find yourself not valuing humans the way God does, you quickly find yourself in the position of the oppressor, in the position of the bully. When you recognize that you're not loving your neighbor as yourself, you quickly find yourself opposing God. When you don't treat people the way you want to be treated, you are opposing God. Because if this is a fundamental character trait of our God, then how you treat people determines how God treats you. Because how you treat people determines what side you're on, the oppressor or the oppressed. And if you are the oppressor, then God opposes you. And that is a scary, scary place to be. So, last question. What if you're that guy? I mean, what do you do then, right? What if you're that guy? What if you just sat down and you heard my terrible examples tonight and you thought, yep, I've been the oppressor. I've been the one who hurts people and who uses people. That's been me. I can think of the relationship where I'm doing that right now. Then what? Well, it's going to sound really simple, but you humble yourself. When you think about these stories, what happened to the oppressor? They were humbled. in a lot of ways. I mean, whether they humbled themselves or they got humbled, humility came knocking. All of Pharaoh's nation was plundered. All of his power taken away, even his own life. Cain oppressed his brother and had a mark put on him. I'm unclear on what that exactly means, but he was cursed by God, told he was going to be a sojourner, a wanderer, and then had a mark placed on him. Like, this is... Sometimes we find ourselves being that guy. And if we are the oppressor, if we end up being the bully, we're going to be humbled one way or another because we're not that guy, you know? And so you have a choice. If you recognize that you're that guy, humble yourself. I immediately think, and I've heard the story of the judges spun a different way, which I think, I like, but I also think the judges were, terrible. So the story of the judges, we often talk about it as like a downward spiral. They get worse and worse and worse, and they do this cycle where they worship idols. They get oppressed. God sends a nation to oppress them and punish them, and then they cry out to God, and then they worship God for a little while, and then God sends a judge, and they worship for a while, and then the judge dies. They worship idols. They get oppressed. They cry out to God. God sends a judge. And it's this story of these people just failing over and over and over and over again. But if you look at the part of it, the positive part here, what do the people do that gets God's attention? Well, for one, they're the oppressed. Suddenly they're on God's side. But for two, all they do is cry out to God. That's it. They humble themselves and cry out to God for deliverance. Over and over and over again. And the answer is yes. If you find yourself in the role of oppressor, humble yourself. Take the role, switch teams, maybe I should say, switch sides. Stop it. Like the Bob Newhart skit. Just quit, all right? Quit being that guy, all right? But humble yourself. Humble yourself and cry out to God. That is... He says yes. I mean, when you switch teams, suddenly you find yourself on the side that God listens to and sees and acts on behalf of. If you want to be humble, simply cry out to God. And this involves a lot of other things too. I mean, you have to repent and change the way that you treat people. You have to take action. It is not simply enough to honor God with your lips. Don't misunderstand the simplicity of what we're saying here. But the initial step, that's all it is. You think about Samson. At the end of his life, he's blind and enslaved and being mocked. And all he does is, God, be with me one more time. Be with me one more time. Down go the buildings. Back comes the strength. Down go the buildings. One thing, that's all he did, was he humbled himself and he cried out to God. And so if you find yourself opposing God because you're the oppressor, humble yourself. Turn back to God. That's the invitation tonight. I mean, the invitation always is humble yourself and turn back to God, away from your sin and to God for salvation. But if you're already a Christian, then this is the constant invitation is to be constantly humbling yourself. Be on the side that God is for. Don't find yourself opposing God by oppressing people, because how you treat people determines, in part, how God is going to treat you. And you don't want to find yourself opposing God. So if you are that, then repent and humble yourself before God, and he will be on your side once again. And if you need prayers of the church, or if you need to confess sins, this is the time to do that. We can help you however you need if you'll come while we stand and sing.